Okay, we should be all good. Thank you. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming today to support the World Affairs Council of Greater Reading. I'm pleased to announce that we have a total of 23 students attending today's program from the following schools: Muhlenberg Junior High, Muhlenberg Senior High, Penn State, Wilson, and Governor Mifflin. So thank you so much for coming. Next, I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Mary Thompson Jones, who is presenting on America in the Arctic and foreign policy and competition in the melting North. Mary Thompson Jones is a professor at the U.S. Naval War College. For joining the USNWC, she directed a master's program in global studies at Northeastern University. Prior to entering academia, she had a highly successful diplomatic career spanning 23 years as a U.S. Foreign Service officer in leadership roles in the Czech Republic, Canada, Guatemala, Spain, and Washington, D.C. She retired with the rank of Minister Counselor, having received several superior and meritorious honor awards along the way. Dr. Thompson Jones' new book, America in the Arctic, Foreign Policy and Competition in the Melting North, has been praised by Senator Angus King from Maine as, quote, a finely crafted chart that can guide us through rough seas ahead to a peaceful and prosperous future. She is also the author of To the Secretary Leaked Embassy Cables and America's Foreign Policy Disconnect. Please join me in greeting our speaker with a round of applause.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
Great. Well, many thanks to Lynn Brown, many thanks to Mike Sutton and the others who organized this, and a special shout out to all the students. I love the fact that people find the Arctic important enough to gather at the middle of the day and come together as part of a civic community. In the course of writing this book, I've had the privilege of talking to a lot of groups like yours, and I never cease to be humbled and gratified that Americans from all walks of life find it important and interesting to invite people like me who are interested in discussing foreign affairs, the place of the United States in the world today. And it's wonderful that this is not something that only happens at universities, but also happens at community gatherings all across the country. So many, many thanks for your interest in this. So with that, I'd like to get started and go ahead and share my screen and get started with the slideshow. So unfortunately, I can't see.
No, we got it.
You've got it. Okay. So the title of the presentation is How Americans Got Their Idea of the Arctic. And I do have to say that in my current position as a professor at the U.S. Naval War College, I'm speaking on my own behalf, not as a representative of the U.S. government, the Department of the Navy, or the U.S. Naval War College. And I also have to say that this is a very American-centric presentation because that's my area of expertise and my background. I realize there are other points of view. Certainly our Arctic partners have other points of view. I also have to say that I'm not native. I don't live in the region. And, that gives me my niche from which to talk in. And admittedly, my area of expertise is not that of others. Okay, so I thought we'd explore the Arctic through four lenses: the cultural, geographic, security defense, security political, and also scientific environmental. The idea here is just to key off some ideas in your mind, and then we can go in any direction you'd like in terms of the questions. One thing that's really clear is that the Arctic is multidimensional multi-domain, by which we mean it's not only about the Arctic Ocean, it's also about the lands that surround the Arctic, the air above it, and the sea and subsea surface below it. And it's also increasingly multidisciplinary. There's room for scientists who've long been up there. There's also room for anthropologists, ethnographers, historians, artists, and even people who are students of policy like me. So let's start with an impression that many Americans historically might have had of the Arctic, and it comes from the Bible, from the book of Job. This might well have been the first understanding that our ancestors had about the Arctic. And I love this little excerpt because it suggests that, as the text goes, from the breath of God, ice is given and the broad waters are frozen. What they're saying effectively is only God can make ice. That's an interesting interpretation, but it's one that is somewhat widespread because if Americans from 200, 300 years ago could read at all, and if they had a book in their homes, it was likely to have been the Bible. The second part of this that I want to share with you is an image. This is the Septentrionalium Terrarum, which is a fancy Italian name for one of the maps, one of the oldest known maps of the North. This is by a guy that you may know as Mercator, Gerardus Mercator, and he actually drew this map in 1569. What I like about it is that there are several things that he got right or nearly right. You can see in the center, there is this black rock. He describes it as a magnetic rock. So clearly there's some awareness of magnetic poles, even at that time. He also describes a maelstrom off the coast of Norway. There is indeed a maelstrom, not nearly as dramatic as people in those times might have thought, but it does exist. And lastly, he had a description not only of Greenland, which is recognizable in the lower left-hand corner, but that there were people in Greenland. He saw women in Greenland who were of short stature. This would be a good description of Inuit Greenlandic people today, and it's quite possible that the men were away hunting when the early encounters happened with Europeans, and thus this informed early thinking about what might be up north. So fast forwarding to America, one of our most famous painters is the landscape artist Frederick Church. And this painting, which was originally titled The North, was unveiled by Frederick Church of the Hudson Landscape School back in 1861. It was a monumental painting in that it was huge. It took up more than a room. And it was his habit to exhibit one painting at a time and charge admission. And people in New York actually paid a quarter back in 1861 to see this. It was quite dramatic. There were curtains and a darkened room. He would slowly open the curtains and people would have their first glimpse, perhaps of ever that they had seen, of an iceberg. What's interesting about this is that he could find no buyers for this painting. And that might have had to do with some really bad timing on his part. It was in April, just before the Civil War began, and he called the painting The North because he was a sympathizer with the North. And so there was the idea that the North was support for the North in the Civil War conflict, but also, of course, the High North or the Arctic. And he promised the proceeds of the sale of the painting would go to support the Northern cause. People were nervous. Nobody had the kind of money to do that. So he decided to sell this in London. He retitled the painting because the Brits were a little bit more ambivalent about who they were going to side with. So he didn't want to politicize the painting. He also added to the painting, and you can see that now, there's a broken mast of an old ship in the bottom. One of the early reviews of the painting was that it was far too austere, it was remote, there was no sign of life in it, and this was his attempt to answer those critics. After he successfully sold it to a railroad magnate, it disappeared. No one knew what happened to it, which is amazing because it's so large. It was finally rediscovered at an English boys' school up in the attic, and it was put on the market. And luckily, it was purchased by the Dallas Museum of Art, where you can see it to this day. So I show this to you because it had a huge impact on American images of what the Arctic was like. Here's another artist that's closer to where I live. William Bradford was a maritime artist based in New Bedford, Massachusetts, and he was also fascinated with the Arctic. He put a lot more into his paintings. They were less austere. This painting was made less than a decade after Church's painting. And what's interesting about this is that in addition to the ship that you see, the masted ship in the center, you can see polar bears in the far right-hand corner. So now American painters are starting to understand that the Arctic is more than just a lot of icebergs, and they're sharing this with their viewers. Bradford went one step further. He hired two photographers from Boston to accompany him on his trip, and he engaged them to photograph all aspects of Greenland. And they did so. They put this together in a huge, oversized photographic album. And the idea was to imbue the images that Americans saw of the Arctic with the aura of truth. This is the beginning of a search for authenticity, which is important in understanding how Americans began to look at the Arctic. Fast forwarding again, we have in the left-hand side another painter who not only visited Greenland, he lived in Greenland for about 5 years. His name is Rockwell Kent. He came from New York, and there you see him painting an iceberg, and you see his dog team behind him. He lived like a native Greenlandic person and made a lot of paintings of Greenland, further informing American views of the Arctic. And then just to spread across various artistic media, I also wanted to introduce you to John Luther Adams, who is an American composer. He won the Pulitzer Prize for a work that he composed in Fairbanks, Alaska, almost in the Arctic Circle, which was called The Place Where You Go to Listen. You see him here installing his multimedia presentation in the Museum of the North, which is based on the University of Alaska Fairbanks campus. The fact that this won a Pulitzer Prize, that he was profiled in the New Yorker, suggests that Americans had come a long way in their appreciation and understanding of the Arctic from earlier times. Of course, we can't only look at the visual arts, and certainly Americans were readers. And if we look at both American and Brit tradition, the Anglo-American tradition of literature, we can see a number of well-known writers. Arthur Conan Doyle, of course, more known for Sherlock Holmes. Conan Doyle was a physician, and his first books actually dealt with his experiences sailing as a ship's physician in the far north. I'll talk more about Mary Shelley in the next slide. Charles Dickens needs no introduction, Wilkie Collins, America's own Edgar Allan Poe, and of course, looking at the Alaskan side of the American Arctic, we have John Muir, Jack London, and skipping down to Robert Service, whose poems are quite famous for memorializing the Klondike and the gold rush, the shooting of Dan McGrew. A bunch of the boys were whooping it up at the Malamute Saloon, and it goes on from there. So certainly Americans are starting to receive multiple artistic and cultural impressions about a place that seems at once remote, but perhaps also tantalizingly close at hand. And just to bring us up right to the present, we have in 2025 the most recent iteration of a movie based on Mary Shelley's 1834 Frankenstein novel that has been produced by Hollywood at least for 100 years almost, if not more. There are more iterations of Frankenstein movies than I have time to put in slides. And here too, Americans' impressions and images of the Arctic are informed by cinematic tradition. So moving to the next lens through which to analyze the Arctic is the geographic one. So you may think you know where the Arctic is. Here is a map from my school where I teach, the Naval War College. This map irritates me no end. It's huge. It takes up a wall of a classroom. And what's wrong with the map, you may already have figured this out, is Greenland. Greenland's in the far right-hand corner. Greenland is huge. Greenland is bigger than South America. Greenland is almost as big as Africa. Greenland is bigger than God. Greenland is big, but Greenland is not that big. And we have Mercator to thank for that. And the fact that this map was made in 1992 suggests that many generations of Americans, perhaps even some of you, have seen maps like this in your classrooms. And this has to do with the problems of Mercator projection. Arctic scholars have tried to deal with this in a number of ways, and they've also tried to answer the question of where is the Arctic? So the United States dealt with this question through Congress and through legislation that was passed back in 1984. And Congress's answer to the question is that the Arctic begins at 52 degrees north latitude. Why? Well, because Congress wanted to include the Aleutian Islands, which are off the coast of Alaska. And it's understandable because two of the Aleutian Islands were invaded by Japan during World War II. So it seems important to draw a line around everything that's American and around what we think of as the Arctic. What they did was to bisect Alaska as well, using various river and mountain borders. There are some other ways that Arctic scholars look at the Arctic. The classic definition is 66 degrees 34 minutes north latitude. This is the dotted blue line that you see as a perfect circle around the Arctic. And it satisfies no one. It's man-made, hence it's a dotted line. It doesn't really speak to anything. So scientists have said, well, maybe what we need is the isotherm line. This is 10 degrees Celsius. This is the point at which temperatures don't dip below 50 degrees during July, the hottest month of the year in the Arctic. And maybe this is a better way to measure what is Arctic and what is not. That's the red line that you see, the wavy red line, which coincidentally goes around the Aleutian Islands. It's not too dissimilar to what the US Congress drew. The tree line is yet another way because we're seeing trees moving, and where things could not previously grow, they are now growing. The tree line is a vague, indefinite way to think about the Arctic, but for some branches of scientists, it makes sense. The International Maritime Organization, a very important branch of the United Nations, defines the Arctic as anything north of 60 degrees north latitude. Now, this is interesting because if you look at 60 degrees north latitude, you start to catch all of Greenland. You catch the Shetland Islands, which are the northernmost part of Britain. And then you see world capitals: Oslo, capital of Norway; Stockholm, capital of Sweden; Helsinki, St. Petersburg, and onward. These places don't look very Arctic if you visit them. On the other hand, it definitely includes a lot more people. Other policymakers would talk about the exclusive economic zone, which is the amount of shoreline that each nation state is allowed to claim as its own, its maritime boundaries, its extended continental shelf claims, which are claims underneath the water column. And what you end up with is a little bathtub in the center of the Arctic Ocean that's unclaimed. So you can see that there's still a lot of tussling about what is Arctic. Another question, which is very apt today, is to talk about whose Arctic we are talking about. A lot of native peoples who have lived since time immemorial in the Arctic think that they have a special claim to the Arctic. It doesn't go along with nation state lines. It predates that, and it spans Alaska, Canada, much of the province of Inuit, or the territory, Canadian territory of Nunavut, and Greenland, as well as some parts of Russia. The problem with this is that not very many people live there. We're talking about 180,000. They do meet, they are politically organized, they see themselves as a lobbying group to remind their national capitals that they are stakeholders and that decisions that are made about them in Ottawa or Washington, D.C., or Copenhagen or Nuuk have an impact on their lives. And they're the ones that are on the front lines of all that is going on in the Arctic right now. Last map I will show you is an interesting debate between Alaska and the state of Maine. Alaska is indisputably America's reason that we are an Arctic nation. And as you can see, the white line is the 66-degree north latitude, and much of Alaska is included. Maine is by no means an Arctic state. On the other hand, Maine has been somewhat successful in positioning itself as an Arctic gateway to the European Arctic. And this has caught traction because if you look at Alaska, it's a different sort of neighborhood. Short of 50 miles through the Bering Strait, you reach Russia, not a particularly friendly neighborhood, particularly right now. If you look at Maine, you see that Portland, the main port in Maine, is the gateway to not only Greenland, but Iceland and England, all the Scandinavian countries. And there's an interesting market available. There's a lot of goods and people transiting back and forth. So this makes Maine's bid, its value proposition, an interesting one and one that they have been able to exploit. So there's another question that's relevant for political reasons in the United States, which is we've looked at the latitudinal lines, how far south do we go? But we also need to look at the horizontal lines. Where does the Western Hemisphere begin and end? Because if we look at the Arctic as a hemispheric proposition, then we're in a different conversation talking about different things. This is relevant today because of the conversation about Greenland. And in case you thought President Trump was the first president to talk about Greenland, it turns out that many of his predecessors had thought a lot about Greenland. I find it intriguing that FDR, in his effort to persuade Congress and the American people that the United States needed to be more engaged in the North Atlantic, used Greenland as a means of making that argument. And in his fireside chats, which he was famous for, his means of communicating with the American people, there he is in the Oval Office talking by radio or wireless to his American constituents and saying that something called the Monroe Doctrine applied to Greenland. Those of you who took history know that the Monroe Doctrine goes back to President Monroe and essentially says Europeans have no place in the Western Hemisphere. The Western Hemisphere should be run by the United States. If you place Greenland in the Western Hemisphere, then obviously it's part of the security picture of the United States. This mattered in 1940 because the Nazis had just invaded Denmark. Denmark had control not only of Greenland, but also Iceland. And there was great fear in the United States that if the Nazis managed to take Greenland, American security would be at risk. At the time, America was still a neutral power. We'd not yet entered the war. Pearl Harbor had not happened. But Roosevelt is trying to make the pitch, and notice that he's talking about the lack of distance. And that was back then. Of course, now it's even a shorter flight to get from the United States to Greenland. And since last June, it's possible for American tourists to fly directly from Newark, New Jersey, directly to Nuuk, Greenland. This is also newly relevant because perhaps in response to President Trump's talk about Greenland shortly after he took office, Northcom decided that Greenland would fall under its areas of responsibility, its AORs. They moved Greenland. Greenland doesn't move, of course, it's an immutable object, but they redrew the map. It's not the first time the map has been redrawn, probably won't be the last time, but very interesting to see that one of the US combatant commands considers it important to consider Greenland as part of its homeland security defense. We can talk more about that during the Q&A. So let's also look at the security political lens and the challenge of presence. One of the big criticisms of the United States is that while we may legitimately be an Arctic country, we sure don't act like it. We're not very present in the Arctic. And this is true when you look at places like Russia. Senator Dan Sullivan of Alaska created this map, loves to show it, to point out how Russia has militarized the Arctic, has taken over the Arctic, and the United States has been left with its hands in its pocket, not doing much at all. We do have a few bases that you see in Alaska, and the one at the top is what used to be called Thule, now is called Pituffik in Greenland. And he is not wrong. The Russians definitely have a major military presence in the Arctic. However, Russians invaded Ukraine in 2022, and as a direct result of that, both Finland and Sweden became full members of NATO. So now we have a NATO lake, as some would call it, with 7 of the 8 Arctic states all NATO members. What's also interesting is that all the blue here is NATO, and you can see that the North Atlantic waters, the various gulfs, the Kattegat and the Skagerrak going into the North Atlantic are all bounded by NATO nations. This makes life a little bit more complicated for Russia, but there are submarines, there are airplanes that fly over this, and it is definitely contested waters. We've seen a lot more military activity in the North Atlantic, not only since Russia invaded in 2022, but before that as well. As a result, over here in Iceland, we see a lot of Poseidon aircraft operated by the US Navy in cooperation with Iceland, which is a NATO ally, and with a rotating staff of 10 other North Atlantic NATO members. US military is engaged in a lot more cold weather training because if you're going to have an Arctic presence, you need to be prepared, and much of our military doesn't have a lot of experience in the Arctic. A lot of our military have served in CENTCOM region in countries like Iraq and Afghanistan, which didn't give them a lot of opportunity to experience the kind of challenges that come in operations that occur in the North or the high North. So yes, it's become an area of increasing tensions, to be sure. Here's another map done by our Canadian friends showing military sites, military installations. There's a lot more going on in the Scandinavian high north than there used to be, and you see the result of that in Sweden and Finland and Norway's various military sites, as well as more in Canada and more in the United States as well. Non-Arctic states are also involved, and none more so than the Chinese. China in 2019 came out with its first Arctic policy statement and declared itself to be a near Arctic nation. It's not a concept that fell on ears that were glad to hear it, and there was a lot of pushback. There's no such thing as a near Arctic nation. Nonetheless, China has definitely upped its presence in the Arctic, and it has formed a partnership with Russia. China's happy to buy the oil and gas that Russia produces in the Yamal Peninsula in the Russian Arctic. And China has upped its game in terms of presence, more icebreakers, more maritime presence, and a lot more research going on as well. Last summer, we saw a lot of this happening off the coast of Alaska, much to the distress of the US Coast Guard, who doesn't have a lot of icebreakers to meet this challenge. Speaking of icebreakers, the winner in terms of the most icebreakers is, of course, Russia. Not all of their icebreakers have military purposes. Russia has tried to commercialize the Arctic through its North Sea route. Ice has melted much faster on the Russian side of the Arctic than it has on the Western Hemisphere side, and icebreakers are needed in order to keep the commercial traffic going through the Northern Sea route. What's complicated this is the number of sanctions and the countries that no longer will use the Northern Sea route because of Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine. So that hasn't stopped. The Russians are continuing to build more and more icebreakers. They see a great commercial future in the Arctic. U.S. has been slow to build icebreakers. And coming from the Navy as I do, I can tell you that we have been slow to build anything at all. Our shipbuilding and shipwright industries have fallen on hard times. We have trouble attracting people to the trades. And under the previous administration, we forged something called an ice pact with Canada and Finland, two great NATO allied partners, both of whom have more experience recently building icebreakers in the high north. One of the very interesting diplomatic activities that took place was the effort by the Finns to court the Trump administration and persuade it to pursue this ice pact that was begun under a previous administration. And frankly, America didn't really have a lot of alternative if we wanted to get something built quickly. Finland can build an icebreaker in about 2 years' time. The United States has funded various icebreaker initiatives going back to the National Defense Authorization Acts of 2019. Here we are, almost in 2026, and we've rolled still. There's efforts happening, but we don't have any holes in the water yet. So this is an issue for us, and certainly if we want presence, we need icebreakers to get there. Here's a great one from Finland. Here's what Canada has. Here's what we're working on. This is new. This is being built in Texas. One of the great things about Congress is the incentive to make sure that any kind of military equipment, particularly high-end equipment, is spread out among a lot of states. So, in fact, the Gulf Coast, Alabama, Louisiana also has a long tradition of shipbuilding for the U.S. government. Texas now is getting into the act as well. And I think at this point, people are happy for any kind of partnership. Davy Defense is actually not an American company. It's based in Quebec, Canada. What has held us up before has been the Buy America Act, the idea that anything that goes into the hands of our military must be 100% American made. Congress has begun to soften the stance on that, given the difficulties that we're having standing up our industry quickly enough to get material or aircraft, or in this case, ships into the military quickly enough. Very quickly, I want to touch on the scientific and environmental lens, which might also be important for our Q&A session. Recently, we've seen a lot of budgetary and political constraints against American science. American science doesn't have the same problem of presence. We have, in fact, been present in the Arctic for a long time. One of the reasons that we're looking at the Arctic has been the loss of sea ice. And we know this because we have had satellite coverage since 1979. And the two dots that you see on the red line are the March maximum, the point at which the ice is at its greatest extent, and the September minimum. And you can see that although it is erratic, it has gone downhill quite quickly over time. We have scientists from a number of disciplines that are tracking that and trying to figure out why. We have other scientific projects going on as well. And one that I love to talk about is Summit Station, because it is right smack in the middle of Greenland on top of the Greenlandic ice shield. It was constructed in 1989 by the National Science Foundation with significant difficulty. There is nothing up there. Everything has to be brought in. It has been staffed year-round, which is no small feat, and we do this in cooperation with our Danish allies and with the Greenlandic peoples and other European science as well. We share the scientific findings. Science is very collaborative by its nature. We've also used the summit station as part of the base from which we do the ice sheet project. We've been able to pull up 2 miles of ice core so that scientists, geologists, other branches of science can examine what's underneath Greenland's ice shield. What's fantastic about this is sustained by the National Guard. National Guard gets a lot of headlines these days. Here's one thing I wish they would get more headlines for doing. This is the 109th. They're based out of Stratton, New York, not too far away from all of us, part of the East Coast of the US. And every year they do this. This is their big project. They have 4 LC-130s that have skis on them, or skids, so they can land right on the ice shield because there's no possibility of a runway there. They handle all the fuel. They bring the scientists, they take them out, they bring all the science equipment, take them out, and they do this for both Summit Station and East Grip. I think that's a wonderful example of military scientific cooperation. I think there's a lot more of that going on, and the value of the science that they're conducting is immeasurable. They are discovering new things about Greenland, about the nature of ice, about climate research, environmental research that is essential to our understanding of the Arctic and the North. So I didn't talk a lot about land, so let me leave you with this land-based slide because I did say that the Arctic is multi-domain. Permafrost is what we see on land in the Arctic. It just means land that doesn't thaw out from one year to the next. We're losing permafrost. It's turning into sponge. It means that the built environment of the Arctic is crumbling. It's hard to place things there. At the same time that the permafrost is thawing, we're seeing coastal erosion. We're seeing rising sea levels. People are losing their homes. Entire villages in Alaska are being wiped out, and villagers in Alaska are having to be relocated, great expense to the state, but at incalculable expense to their sense of their home, their ancestry, their connections to their land. Also, from a scientific point of view and a medical point of view, the melting land allows pathogens that have been locked under ice forever to be released. We've seen anthrax, we've seen other things starting to arise. We've seen a lot of methane, which will have consequences for various scientific problems in the future. And as I mentioned, infrastructure challenges. So 4 different lenses to look at the Arctic. I hope this stimulates your thoughts about it and we can engage in a discussion about it. I'd love to know what's on your mind, what you think, and willing to go any direction you'd like to. Thank you.
Everyone here? Oh, appreciate this. Thank you. We got back up if you need it. Very good.
Professor, that was a fantastic presentation. Really enjoyed it, and I'm sure we'll have a lot of questions for you. We have a series of rules that we try to maintain. Each person is asked to limit themselves to 1 question at the start, and I hang on to the mic. We really encourage the students here to come up with questions. Who wants to kick us off? Okay, Professor Newnham, Penn State. Oh, I'm ready.
Thank you. So I'm sure you're well aware of the Trump administration's efforts to apparently take over Greenland. And I'm wondering if you can comment on where that stands now, because I think we haven't heard as much about it in the last 4 or 5 months at least, where that stands now and where that might be going in the future.
Thanks for that question. I'm not part of the Trump administration. I don't have any recent information on it. I've tracked this question quite closely, the same way you do. Uh, Apart from moving Greenland into Northcom, that's the only concrete thing I've seen. And that, if you're a Greenlandic person, you wake up one day, you're in Northcom, I don't think that really makes much of a difference in your life. We saw a flurry of visits from the vice president. But beyond that, it's kind of been a blip. I was very interested that the national security strategy, every presidential administration writes a national security strategy. Trump administration just published this about 4 days ago. I looked carefully to see what was being said about Greenland. Nothing. I also looked for the Arctic. Nothing. I tried various other areas that I'm interested in. Didn't see anything. So I don't know if the pushback from Denmark has forestalled anything, but I agree with you. I haven't heard much about it lately. I think the Danes and perhaps other European Union partners have stepped up their interest in Greenland. What I will say is that I think the administration was hoping for more American investment, because sometimes investment comes first and then the military follows investment. And that's the real puzzle here, because one of the rationales was critical minerals hidden under the ice in Greenland. No one knows for sure what's there. It's very hard to penetrate the kind of ice that still sits on much of Greenland. But we're not seeing a rush from American entrepreneurs to get in there. What little mining or mineral development is occurring is Australian, Canadian, but really, surprisingly, not much American. So I kind of have to shrug my shoulders as you do, and we'll have to wait and see.
Question, here we are, hold on a second. I'm getting with you, Larry.
Sorry, I didn't hear that last one.
I would ask it. What are the major perceived economic benefits or activities that countries see in the Arctic region?
Thanks. Yes. I think it's waiting to become the new Klondike, the new gold rush, and critical minerals are definitely where people are looking. As I just mentioned, maybe not so much in Greenland, but certainly other parts of the Arctic. The state of Alaska exists largely because of the oil strike off Prudhoe Bay, and it changed the economic of Alaskan fortunes almost overnight. It made Alaska a very wealthy state for a while, but Alaska's economic trajectory has risen and fallen with the price of oil. And that brings up kind of a new lens to look at the Arctic, which is the economic lens. If your fortunes are based on extractive industries, oil, gas, minerals, you're dependent on market prices. Sometimes you'll make a killing. Other times the price will dip so low that it's not worth your time or expense to deal with all that you have to do in order to set up the infrastructure necessary. And unlike the lower 48, where you're working on land and it's pretty easy to set things up or take them down, doing anything in the Arctic in terms of infrastructure and sustaining it is super costly, super expensive. Everything has to be flowing in. We've seen that with Prudhoe. One of the things that I think people thought would happen with the development of the state of Alaska was that it would create a community, and we would see roughnecks coming in, flying in, bringing their families. They'd start building elementary schools, kind of like what happens at American base. You know, there'd be a movie theater, there'd be grocery stores, there'd be shopping centers. None of that happened in Prudhoe. It became a fly-in, fly-out operation. You're in there for 3 weeks, you go home for 3 weeks. So a bunch of guys with the expertise and the experience from Texas, from Alberta, from other places, saw this as a great way to support their families, but they didn't bring their families with them. I suspect that that's a model that we'll see again in the Arctic. We've seen that a little bit in Russia. Russia lacks workers because it has such a vast territory. They bring in people from Uzbekistan, from Kazakhstan, from other places. These people aren't interested in living in remote areas in Siberia. They're interested in making a buck. They're flying in, they're flying out. So that's an interesting model, but it brings with it a lot of problems. So I think for the moment, it's looking like development will be erratic based on discoveries, big strikes, and tempered by world market prices.
I have a student question. Tell me what school you're from, and then you give us your question. Here you go.
I'm from Muhlenberg School District, and I wanted to ask how you think like the cultural perceptions of the Arctic affect how we have how America has this relationship with it.
Thanks so much. I'm so glad you asked a cultural question. I think Americans' impressions of the Arctic are just exploding. You see so many more podcasts, you see so much more on Instagram, other social media. Uh, Wealthy Americans are going up on cruises. There's what we call last chance tourists who want to see an iceberg before they're all gone. They want to see the Arctic before it melts, before it changes. So that's one end of the spectrum. I also think that there's a lot of adventure travelers. Now that there's a flight that goes from Newark, New Jersey to New Greenland in 4 hours, it means that outdoor tourism brings younger Americans who are willing to go camping in Greenland. And the same is true in Alaska, of course, and in Canada. And I suspect in the Scandinavian Arctic, you have little villages like Rovaniemi and Coruna in Sweden, where you can see ice sculptures, ice works of art. You can sleep in an ice cave. And it's great in the sense that it brings more people and gives them lived experience, even for a short period. Natives who live in these places see this sometimes as disruptive, disrespectful, and it's one way to counter the kind of extractive industries and the economic benefit that those bring if you expand it to tourism. But tourism brings its own good and its own evils.
Very good. Professor Jones, how did you get interested in the Arctic?
Well, thanks for that question. As you can see, I'm not a scientist, but I am a diplomat. I'm a retired diplomat, and I served in Canada, in Quebec, and I was able to go with my ambassador on a helicopter ride up to James Bay. And if you're Canadian, you know that, well, James Bay is not really Arctic, but I'm born and raised in Los Angeles. So for me, this was starting to get pretty exotic, and I was pretty far north of my own experience. And I was so intrigued with it. And I was intrigued with the policy questions. What keeps bringing me back to the Arctic is looking at the United States trying to grapple with what it means to be an Arctic nation, how to be present, and trying to construct a narrative. That's why I opened the presentation with slides about American artists, because I think the average American doesn't wake up in the morning thinking about the Arctic. And it's just so interesting to see how popular culture has tried to impact that, and that we never seem to lose our fascination with it. The fact that there's a new movie on Frankenstein is fantastic. The number of coffee table books on beautiful photographs of the Arctic has just exploded. And, you know, there was a lot of talk when we talked about my book. You can see the cover on it over there. I said, okay, well, the one thing I don't want on the cover of my book is an iceberg because it's been done. And indeed, they ended up going with flags, which I really liked because I was looking at the policy and the relationship of the United States to all of its Arctic partners. So yeah, the culture of it is what brings me back. I've had lots of trips since. I was able to talk at a university in Nuuk in Greenland and was very excited to see what the Danes had built, what Greenlandic people had built, and to get a better handle long before Trump was talking about it as to what is the dynamic between Denmark and Greenland, and try to understand that from a little bit of an outsider's perspective. And what I uncovered was that, well, in some ways, this is a theme and variation on the dialogue that the United States has had about its historic treatment of Native peoples. Canada has also had this very painful dialogue in terms of residential schools. I think all Western countries have been guilty. Certainly the Scandinavian countries have had Truth and Reconciliation Commission meetings with Sami people, who are their native peoples in the Scandinavian side of the Arctic. And it seems like it's an impulse for non-Arctic nations to civilize Arctic peoples, to bring them the benefits of civilization, to take the children, to introduce them to dominant languages rather than encourage them to have their own languages, and to sort of integrate them into the nation's fabric. It may have been a pure-hearted idea back in the day, but it quickly deteriorated into child abuse and horrible problems. Canada, you may know, has exhumed about 2,000 graves of Native First Nations children who were taken from their parents and enrolled in residential schools. The United States also has a terrible record on this, and now we're hearing more about Denmark's relationship with Greenland. So yes, these cultural, sociological, and political issues are what keeps me engaged in this region.
Thank you very much. Oh, great. We have some more questions here. Let me now turn to Rodney Laperle, who I can always count on to have a new question.
Good.
Okay, the U.S. relationship with some of our territories, I'm thinking certain Pacific islands and even to an extent Puerto Rico, the locals have a large degree of autonomy, largely foreign policy and military protection falling under the U.S. national auspices. Do you think there would be a potential for something like that to apply to Greenland? Would the locals be interested in anything like that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and I like your analogy of Puerto Rico. I was fascinated that last March, Greenland happened to have its scheduled election. I have a slide, not in this deck, but of the Greenlandic Parliament, and the room in which they meet is about the size of a middle school classroom. There are 31 members of the Greenlandic Parliament, and there are 5 political parties, so you can kind of do the math. The entire population of Greenland is 56,000. You subtract the children under 18 and the old people, and you come out with a labor force, an active population of maybe 25,000, 30,000. As development has happened, more and more of them have moved away from villages to concentrate in urban areas, primarily Nuuk, the capital, also Ilulissat, and a few other larger towns. So given that President Trump had already made his speech and talked about Greenland quite a bit, I was really interested in the outcome of this election, as was everyone, I imagine. So the thing about the 5 political parties in Greenland is all of them espouse the desire for independence from Denmark. But this is where it's a spectrum. Some of them, the ones generally speaking to the furthest left, want independence tomorrow morning, instantly, immediately. No more waiting. We've waited too long. And then you get into gradations as you move across the political spectrum. Yes, we want independence, but maybe in 5 years. Yes, we want independence, but we have to figure out an economic model so that we can become self-supporting. Yes, we want independence, but we're not sure how we want to align ourselves. So I was fascinated to see who would win the election. To my surprise, the furthest camp, the furthest political party that wants it tomorrow, did not win the majority. A party slightly more to the center won the majority and is now governing Greenland. So this tells us, I think, something interesting. You know, Greenland has had home rule for about 45 years. It's had what the Danes call self-rule for more than a decade, about 15 years now. If Greenland wanted to be independent, there's no indication that Denmark would stop it. What's stopping it is the Greenlandic people themselves, their hesitation, their sense that their realism, perhaps, and pragmatism, that they don't yet have an economic formula in which it makes sense. With the world's largest island, I know I made fun of the Mercator map, but yes, it is very large, and a population of 56,000, it is the least densely populated place in the world. There are many parts of Greenland that are absolutely uninhabited, particularly the part facing Europe on the northwestern coast. How would it manage? These are serious, important questions. And these are questions really that Greenlanders need to figure out and for themselves. I think there are interesting alternatives. They have flirted with the European Union. However, like a lot of high north nations, they don't like the European Union's very restrictive fishing policies. Norway is not a member of the European Union. Iceland is not a member of the European Union. Why? Because of fishing policies. They have association memberships, but they are less than full members because of this. So, you know, it's interesting to speculate, where will Greenland be 5 years from now, 10 years from now? Is it fated to become a nation? You know, we have seen other micronations with far less territory who've also struggled to assert themselves. Is there some other governance mechanism? Greenland looks to Nunavut, which is a Canadian territory, as something that is similar in terms of the kinds of people, the population, the kinds of problems. So is there some sort of an economic political association that the countries would allow to happen? Because, of course, Nunavut is not a sovereign nation. It is a territory of Canada. There's no sense that Canada would support sovereignty for Nunavut. So yes, I realize this is a rambling sort of answer, but I wanted to give you all the various things that go through my mind when I think about the future of Greenland. Thanks for asking the question.
That information. Hold on a second, another question here. For a moment.
So I have a suggestion and a question. I recently saw a New Yorker documentary called Haul Out, which is sort of a stunning depiction of the effect of the Arctic ice melt on migratory walruses. I was wondering if you've seen that, and if you have any other suggestions of information about the ice melt chart.
Yeah, I have not seen that documentary. However, I happen to subscribe to the New Yorker, and the current issue has a fantastic article about native polar bear hunters and what has happened in the past 30 years, what's happened to dog sleds, what's happened to the terrain that they go on, and what's happened to the polar bear population. And it's all told through the lens of a guy who's been doing this his whole life, and he must be well into his 50s or 60s. I don't have the magazine in front of me on my desk right now, but it's this week's issue of the New Yorker. And I teach an Arctic class as an elective at my school, and I've just added it to the reading list for my students because it's so well written and it provides such a hard to find perspective. You know, it's really easy to fly into Nuuk, walk around, have a photographer, talk to a few locals, fly out, go home, write a big piece. That's one kind of journalism. But actually getting in there, living, going around, riding along on a sled with a guy who does this for a living, who's able to speak English so you can establish communication and really get into it, man, that's a different kind of journalism. So I will definitely look for this documentary that you described, and I recommend to you the article that I just described.
Member question.
Can you help us understand China and what it's looking for in the Arctic when you showed all the maps? I didn't
Yeah.
see any Arctic touching China. Do you think they're gonna build an island and claim it as part of China?
Yeah. I spend a lot of time at my school, the Naval War College, and all that my colleagues want to talk about is the South China Sea. And they are rightly concerned about it because there's a lot of indication that the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, is gearing up, a lot of focus on Taiwan, and a lot of concern from the US side about what's going to happen if there's going to be a near peer conflict. And how would we make out? What advantages would we have? What advantages would China have? So I think for a lot of people, the Arctic is an afterthought. And I think that's true for the Chinese as well, because as vast as they are and with the depths of manpower that they have, it's very difficult to manage a two-front war or two-front operations. I think there is a legitimate scientific interest. Chinese have Arctic scholars, just as all nation states do. I think their interest is perhaps disproportionate, and I am also very skeptical about dual use science because we have seen the Chinese habit of erecting what seems like an observatory for astronomical purposes, turning into a satellite tracking facility. We've seen efforts to do this in Sweden, in Finland, and Norway. And unlike other nations that have seen the Silk Road and all that comes with the economic Silk Road, China had launched what it called a polar Silk Road. However, Norway, Sweden, Finland were far more able to fend off the Chinese. They weren't going to fall into debt traps, certainly. And they had the sophistication and the understanding of Northern science to understand what's baloney when they see it. China tried to establish a golf course in northern Iceland in a place that sheep have trouble grazing. And the Icelanders said, yeah, no, we're not going to sell you 3% of our land, so you can do that because clearly the attraction here is to do a port. Iceland also had an experience with China in which they tried to do a trade agreement. If you've been to Iceland, you know that you can get really nice sweaters that are hand knit by something called the Icelandic Women's Knitting Collective. This is a co-op, and this is piecework, but this is done Icelandic style. Iceland has a special breed of sheep that are suited for Icelandic terrain, which is very different because of volcanic soil and other things. And these cooperatives have been knitting sweaters for decades and decades. And if you're a tourist, you can go and you can buy one. Iceland decided, without consulting the women's collective, to sell all the wool, the raw material, to China. China took it back. China tried to construct Icelandic style sweaters, stuck made in China on it, shipped it back to Iceland, where it appeared in shops frequented by tourists. Icelandic Women's Knitting Collective saw this and all hell broke loose. The Icelandic government had to back down, cancel the agreement with China, and say, we're so sorry, this was a mistake, we can't do this. So that by way of a really homey example of how Scandinavians are nobody's fools. And they're not going to play the suckers game with China quite so easily. But yeah, we're seeing a lot of Chinese presence, and I think it's rattled Congress. We're seeing the funding for defense initiatives, particularly in Alaska. We're now building a deep water port in Nome, Alaska, where not many people live. And it's not hard to imagine that we're doing that as a means of upping our military. We assign the Coast Guard primary responsibility for the Arctic. The Navy is really happy that the Coasties have it because the Navy is fully occupied elsewhere. On the other hand, the Navy is under increasing pressure from Congress, who are saying, no, you can't just hand off. We want a surface presence. Navy's happy to do a submarine presence. They're happy, along with Space Force and the Air Force, to do the overhead flights. They're really not happy about a surface presence because they just don't have the ships.
Okay, we'll wrap it up. Question from Deb.
Okay, you showed a slide that showed a lot of Russian bases along northern Russia. The question is, are they fairly decent vintage, and what is their mission?
Thanks. Great question. Some are, and it's the right question to ask. For example, Kotelny Island was such a major base that Putin, when it opened, actually invited Western media, and you can see CNN reporters walking around on a Russian base, which is absolutely unheard of. And it's a really nice base. It's a base to be proud of, and it's the farthest north that Russia has ever built a base. We don't have anything like it. If you walk around in Patufic Base up in the north of Greenland, it's not quite as nice, I don't think. On the other hand, many of the bases are in name only. Americans tend to think of a base, they think of Fort Bragg, they think of small cities, they think of places with hospitals, schools, all the lovely facilities that military have and certainly deserve as we support them in their missions. Russians don't get nearly the same treatment. Wrangel Island, which is at the top of the Chukchi Sea off the coast of Alaska as you move over to Siberia, a lot of hand-wringing about what on earth the Russians are doing in Wrangel Island. Satellite photos suggest not very much. It gets a little star on the map that Senator Sullivan presents because it adds to his argument that the Russians are everywhere and we are nowhere. Yes, I mean, Wrangel Island is Russian. It belongs to Russia. They are entitled to fortify it as they see fit. I think Russia is overextended. I think Russia, particularly since 2022, has been greatly overextended. If it's going to worry about the Arctic at all, it's going to worry about the European side of the Arctic over in Murmansk, which is just on the other side of Finland, and it's where the Northern Fleet is based. That's where we should be concerned about Russia. And we've upped our game in the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap, which is two waterways through which Russians freely move. It's international waters, they're free to do that. On the other hand, we're free to monitor it. We have seen a lot of Russian mischief in terms of cable cutting. The Norwegian area of Svalbard Island has seen its cables cut. The Baltic nations, Latvia, Estonia particularly, have been the victims of a lot of Russian malign actions. So there's reason to be suspicious, and I think Senator Sullivan is not wrong to try to energize Americans about the imbalance between the Russian presence and the US presence. The difficulty is that for Russia, it's 42 or 50% of the Arctic coastline is indeed Russian territory. For us, the coastline of Alaska is about 12% of the Arctic region. So we don't come to this particular game with equal amounts of territory.
Okay, well, please join me in thanking Dr. Mary Thompson Jones for a wonderful presentation. Great Q&A session.
Thank you very much.
Thank you again. All right, well, just a few announcements here before we conclude. First will be David Carroll. Actually, before David, before you leave, we do have a what do we have back? We have a raffle back there, Dave.
So you want to pick the name here? Don't screw up. So it's Timber?
All right. Okay, David has some membership chair, David Carroll, some comments about a new initiative.
Warren, thank you very much. Uh, Help. We need your help. If you've been regularly attending, you know that the participation, the attendance at our like this, like we've told you, we've had usually in the past have had 80 people between students and members regularly. Oh, thank you. And we're getting less than that now, the last couple of sessions. In the same vein, our membership has been falling off the edge of it. We'd like to rebuild our membership. In order to do that, you people, you are our current members, your attendees at these functions, you're our best recruiters. You know what the organization is all about. You know what you enjoy. You know why other people should come and participate, learn, and enjoy. We'd like to urge you to do that, to reach out to friends, family, whoever. I encourage you, come find out what we're all about. See if they want to become members. We're adding a special incentive that we're announcing at this session. We're going to have a new program, an incentive program for to build membership and to build attendance at our luncheons. And the idea would be any member who brings a friend who in turn becomes a member, that friend gets a free lunch. The member who brought friend who becomes a member gets a free lunch. And we'll be carrying that forward on a one-shot deal. You can't get it twice for two friends. But we'll be carrying that forward on a going basis. We're going to hope to restore membership and to restore a high level of attendance at our lunch functions. Please do so. We really need your help. You're our best resources. You're our best recruiters, the organization. One in the six.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, David. Okay, just a couple more announcements. On your tables, you will find these pamphlets. This is a pamphlet for the Founders Club Fund. This is an initiative the World Affairs Council Board has created to secure the organization's long-term future, similar to an endowment fund. Please look over the brochure, consider making a donation to the Founders Club Fund, or making a part of your legacy or planned giving. All right, lastly, next Wednesday at noon, we will be hosting a virtual presentation from Stephen Carl Pfeiffer on Russia and Ukraine. And so please remember to register for that via our website. And so thank you again for coming, and please drive safely on your way home. Thank you.